Hi everybody, welcome back to the Old Warlock. I'm Alex.
I'm Jim.
And today we're going to be talking about something that I am sure that all of you can relate to on some level. You know, creativity, it's tough sometimes. It's tough to come up with a lot of creative ideas for your world or your character or whatever you might be doing, just straight off the top of your head. And sometimes, as players of role-playing games and Dungeons & Dragons, etc., we have to borrow ideas, borrow creativity, borrow inspiration from some things that we may have read, books, some movies we may have seen, music that we may have listened to, things like that, in order to kind of fuel our imaginations and come up with the ideas that we want to put into our world or our characters. Isn't that right?
This is true, and I think that looking at this subject, I've actually been a little bit surprised at some of the origins of the things that I've put into my campaign.
Yeah.
Some of these things go way back. And I think that would be, we think it's interesting. And so we're going to talk a little bit about just those subjects today.
Some recommendations, the things that you might want to check out if you haven't seen them before or read them before or whatever, that you might be able to incorporate into your worlds.
Now, some of these you won't be able to incorporate in because they're out of print, they don't exist anymore, or they're tough to get a hold of. But yeah. I think you might find some of them interesting anyway, and hopefully it'll encourage you to kind of look back into your own past and see where you got some of your original ideas for your campaign.
Absolutely. So let's get started.
Let's do that. So early on, I was exposed to some really creative things at school, and this is going back to second grade for me. So we're looking at maybe I was 8 years old, somewhere around in there, 7, 8, 9 years old.
A youngster.
A young guy. And the time frame we're looking at here is the late 1960s, early 1970s. And I had some teachers I had some excellent teachers when I was a kid. And they were always, if they recognized that you had some sort of imagination at your disposal and you were interested in things that might push that imagination, they were always there to give you things that would help you expand that. One of the things that I got my start in as far as fantasy concepts, as far as fantasy stories, actually came from something called the programmed reader. This was something that I went through back in first grade. And there's an excellent series of stories in here. Now, the programmed reader, it was meant to, you would read through a story, and then it was all about story retention, it was about spelling, it was about recognizing new words. But the way that they kept the students' attention was by threading those learning concepts all through a story. And there were some characters in these books early on. Some of you may have actually used these in school. There were some characters, it was Sam, there was Anne, his sister, and there was Walter, who was a little boy who lived in the neighborhood. They had a dog named Nip, they had a cat named Tab, but they also knew an elderly couple known as the Roundabouts. And there's a story in these books called The Roundabouts Secret, and in The Roundabouts Secret, the children ended up having to go to a mystical fantasy land, and they had to rescue the roundabouts from a wizard. And the wizard had, what had happened is the wizard had taken the roundabouts and turned them into dolls. And so the children had to go and, number one, find the dolls in this old house that the wizard lived in. But then they had to go on an adventure to find some water from a mountaintop fountain that they then brought back and fed to the dolls that the roundabouts had been turned into to bring them back to life as normal human beings. But they have all kinds of adventures throughout that story. They go to a place where they run into these are falling apart. They go to a place where they run into a prince who lives in a castle, and he is actually supposed to be someone who's very important, and they end up having to get him on his way to fulfill his destiny. But this is going back to first grade for me. And I can definitely say that this story is probably one of the biggest influences I've had in terms of the development of fantasy concepts in my world.
I think that that's fair, because I remember you reading these to me when I was a little little kid about the same age. And, I mean, there's definitely some recognizable comparisons, and it's the same kind of thing for me, where I'm sure that in some way these stories also played a role in my perception of fantasy and what fantasy should be.
Right. And that's really why I introduced these to you when you were so young, was to try and get you to have the same kind of outlook that I have on what fantasy should be.
I wonder if it worked. Look at us now.
Exactly. The one thing that I regret about these books is not knowing who the writer is.
No idea.
I have looked and looked, trying to find out who the staff writers were for, I think this is Houghton Mifflin, which was in the United States. They were a major purveyor of school books. But they had to have had staff writers who came up with the story, and I wish I could find out who they were, because the stories that they did for first graders were excellent. And I regret not being able to find if they did other stories in other venues at some other point in time, or if they were contractors who had been hired to do these stories. I don't know. Hopefully, maybe there's somebody out there who knows a little bit more about these books than I do. If you know anything, please let me know, because these have had a huge influence on the way I play my game and the types of fantasy that I put into my Dungeons and Dragons.
Yes, absolutely. What else you got?
Well, I have more.
All kinds of things.
Another one that another publication that I don't think a lot of people give enough credit to in terms of fantasy ideas, in terms of even science fiction ideas, are comic books. And again, when I was young...
Before you continue,
go ahead.
I would like to say, we are not necessarily comic book people who know a lot about comic books.
Not at all.
So if you are hoping for any discourse on that, you're probably not going to get it from us, unfortunately.
This is very, very true. But I read comic books.
Same.
You read comic books.
Yeah, we did. We are just not the experts.
We are not. If you're looking for expertise on that subject, you need to go someplace else.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I can definitely point to, back in the 1960s and even into the very early 1970s, I read Donald Duck and Scrooge McDuck comic books. I loved the things. Now these were not published originally at that time. These actually date to from the 1940s to the early 1960s. Most of them made by an incredibly creative man by the name of Carl Barks. And in these stories, they're spread out in the comic books. There are some kind of mundane, everyday hijinks type stories. But Carl Barks would also make very lengthy stories, usually involving Uncle Scrooge going and trying to find something from history that he could end up putting into his museum. And then he would take Donald and Huey, Dewey, and Louie along as well, and they would have this great adventure. As a matter of fact, I think it's Steven Spielberg. In Raiders of the Lost Ark, the scene where the big ball rolls down, Indy's going in to steal the idol.
Yep.
The ball rolls down and chases him out of the tomb. That's actually taken from a Scrooge McDuck comic book.
Yeah.
And Steven Spielberg, I think it was Steven Spielberg, acknowledges the fact that he took that out of one of these early comic books because the storytelling, he recognizes that the storytelling in them is so good.
It's cool, yeah.
So a lot of the things that I have in my campaign, you can trace directly to, believe it or not, Uncle Scrooge and Donald Duck comic books from the 1940s through the 1960s. I have a lot of these. In fact, I almost have a complete set of these comic books. They're still a great read. I love going through them.
They're awesome.
They really are good. But again, I guess this points out, it illustrates you never know where you're going to be finding your inspiration. And comic books, that's one of my major ones. I have to believe that a lot of people have taken inspiration from other types of comic books out there in the world. I mean,
the people we play with,
they do.
They absolutely, without a doubt, are that kind of people who are the experts in comic books. And that's, there's undoubtedly inspiration there. And I think that that's one of the things that we want to try and get across, is that it doesn't necessarily have to be a fantasy-themed thing for you to take inspiration from it to put in your Dungeons & Dragons world. A lot of the time it is, undoubtedly, but there are also ideas and things that you can get from other places that are interesting that you can apply, and we definitely have.
Definitely so.
Yeah.
Definitely. I have a couple more that I'll talk about, and then we can
Sounds
switch over
good.
to you. Let's see here. Okay. Very early on, I had a number of authors that I took inspiration from. The very first novel that I read, this was given to me by my second grade teacher, Mrs. Miller, who was a wonderful woman. Daybreak 2250 AD by Andre Norton. This is actually more science fiction based, but it really got me primed for seeking out more stories of post-apocalyptic worlds and people who had to battle against monsters and they had to defend newly acquired terrains, things like that. Daybreak 2250 was probably one of the biggest inspirations for me after the Donald Duck comic books and the programmed readers. I also took a lot of inspiration about the time that I started making my world. This would have been in 1978, 1979. I had been reading more books by Andre Norton. She came up with a series called the Witch World series. And I had just finished reading those about 1975. They came out, I think, in the late 1960s, 1966, maybe 67. But the Witch World series, if you were to read those, you could play in my campaign and you could say that came straight out of the Witch World series. Now, I didn't take necessarily characters out of them. What I took were settings. I took the way that magic was used, the way that magic might have been altered, some by people within certain stories to accommodate certain tasks. So a lot of the magical concepts in my campaign came straight out of Andre Norton's Witch World series, which is an excellent series of books. Another series that I had just finished reading was the Dragon Riders of Perns series by Anne McCaffrey. And those have played a major role in the way that I deal with dragons and the way that I deal with what dragons are there for, what their ecology is. There are a lot of influences that came straight out of Anne McCaffrey's books too. So many of the things that I have in my campaign came from the books that I was reading at the time. A lot of the Conan series. There were a lot of sword and sorcery books that were written in the late 1950s up into the 1960s that I have bits and pieces of inspiration from. But probably the most common things that you'll find in my campaign are things by Andre Norton and Anne McCaffrey.
Yeah.
Another major influence on my campaign.
This is the big one.
Man by the name of Terry Pratchett. And I have to believe that a lot of you know about Terry Pratchett. I think that these are some of the most creative fantasy sorcery books ever written. Really just an incredible man in terms of what he put out. Concepts like sapient pearwood, being turned into things that, having a trunk that follows you around and can do various things for you. I have no end of...
Those don't show up at all.
No, not a bit.
No.
And I'm really grateful that Terry Pratchett's books were available or are available to continue even to influence my campaign. One of the ones that my players will recognize, a book called The We Free Men. And I love the title on this. They're small, they're blue, and nobody messes with them. Well, guess what? That's it. Picked them up almost lock, stock, and barrel and put them into my campaign. I have some characters known as the Pixies, and that's how Terry Pratchett refers to them as I remember. But they're a great character, or a great non-player character to have in the campaign. You guys have come across them on a regular basis.
Love the Pixies. We'll have to do something talking more in depth about those.
They're great, but I wish that I could say, yeah, I'm just a really creative guy and I came up with those. No, I stole them out of Terry Pratchett novels. But Terry Pratchett, another major influence in terms of the way that I put my campaign together.
Yeah.
What about you?
Well, I think that before we get into some of the things that are more specific to me, we should probably talk about some of the things that collectively we have done.
Sure.
I have used some of the same things. The comic books, definitely the books from the very beginning. The Terry Pratchett, not so much. I think I have read the Daybreak 2250 AD, but a lot of the Terry Pratchett, those kind of novels, I'm not quite as in depth with having read. But definitely there are more obvious things, like Lord of the Rings. We are, if you can tell, massive fans of the Lord of the Rings. Never would have guessed. We've watched the movies countless times. And The Hobbit.
Which I actually prefer to Lord of the Rings, as you know.
I prefer Lord of the Rings. We disagree on this all the time, but we pretty much agree. It is the greatest set of fantasy books ever written.
Yeah.
Everything about it is nigh on perfect.
Right.
And
everything else, in my mind, is a pale imitation
is it exactly
of Tolkien's works.
It is. People try and they have failed to come up with something as unbelievably awesome and detailed as Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. But we definitely, there are so many things that are, again, picked up lock, stock, and barrel and dropped into our experiences from Lord of the Rings.
Well, and I think that the whole concept of high fantasy is really, we base our high fantasy concept off of Tolkien's works. I mean, it's
absolutely.
I think that's really the quintessential level that we look at, as far as the feel or the ambiance of the campaign. It's taken directly out of Tolkien's high fantasy.
I mean, there are different ways of doing it, and everybody, I think, approaches it differently. But it's like you do like Lord of the Rings, or you might be like a Game of Thrones person, and they're completely different models. They're the same genre, but they function in very different ways with the inner workings of
different mechanics,
of the worlds themselves. But Lord of the Rings is definitely the route that we go, and I'm sure that if you've read any of the D&D manuals, you can tell that there are direct inspirations. That they're very closely tied together, and so that's where we get a lot of our inspiration from.
Yes.
But then also, we have to talk about, we can't play it most likely, but the songs from Conan the Barbarian.
The original movie.
The original movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger that serve as our combat music when we're fighting.
Yes, and we use music, I wouldn't say sparingly, but it's not going all the time.
It's not,
But when Anvil of Crom comes on, I believe it's Anvil of Crom, you know that something's going to happen. And it's anybody who says that music can't create some sort of a feeling or an emotional response, they're wrong. Because even after having used this for 30 years, 35 years, my players, they hear that and they still get nervous and ready to go into combat.
It's like a Pavlov's dog response,
very much
almost. As soon as you hear the drums at the beginning, what is it? Anvil of Crom is the song.
I think it's Anvil of Crom. Yeah.
As soon as you hear the drums at the beginning, like, you start sweating and you get nervous because you know something's about to happen.
You start looking for your best dice. You've got 30 dice on the table, and you start going through them trying to find that one that you're gonna.
Yeah. But it's that definitely is another thing. So there are some things that we do jointly that are more high fantasy. But while there are a lot of things that we have both used, there are also things that are more probably pertinent to my generation that have come out more recently. And listen, I've looked at YouTube analytics. I know that the demographic of the people who watch our content does not necessarily usually align with my age group and generation. There are exceptions, and that's totally okay. But what I want to do is maybe expose some of you to things that you might not have heard of that are also great forms of fantasy media. And I want to start with a few books. First of all, the only one that I have here with me is the Aragon series by Christopher Paolini. These were, there are 4 books in total. These were written by a high schooler initially. Incredible author. But basically, I think it's kind of similar to Dragon Riders of Pern in that there are people who ride dragons. That's the main focus of the book. It's a story of a guy who finds a dragon egg, raises this dragon by himself, and becomes a member of an order that's long extinct of people who rode dragons. But there's a lot of things in this. It's very high fantasy. It's very similar to Lord of the Rings, I think, both in writing style and in kind of the way that the world is set up. So if you haven't read these, very good books.
And there are 4 of those?
There's 4 in total. This is the first one here. It's got
excellent.
The blue one
really,
on the cover.
They really are good. I don't know how many times you read those.
I've read these countless times throughout growing up. They're fantastic books. Another book, I don't have it here, it's right here, would be the Ranger's Apprentice series by John Flanagan. This is something that you read.
I love those
as well. They're very good
books.
Again, very high fantasy stories about a guy who's apprenticed to a guy who's a ranger for this empire that they live in, and basically they just go on adventures and fight monsters and have wars with different countries and all kinds of different things.
And I love in those that they go to so many different locales. It's not all just forest. They go to the desert. They go to.
Each book basically has a different setting that they find themselves in that you could pretty well compare. The North Africa, Japan, all kinds of different places that they go to and have adventures in. And so there's a lot of places from which you could take inspiration for your campaign. There's a lot of character development. They're really great books.
Yeah, really good characters.
And then I'm sure if any of you are my age or you have kids that are my age, you have heard of the Percy Jackson series, which is just something that I wanted to bring up because it is very influential in my perceptions of fantasy. Books about fictionalized Greek gods in a modern setting with kids who are offsprings of those gods going through and having adventures. It's more modern. It's not set in a fantasy setting. Like I said, it's modern era. But again, very good books in terms of giving ideas for what gods can do and how they behave.
I think that's really a good point, because I think it's not so much that you would pick up things from the Percy Jackson books and drop them into your campaign necessarily, but it's the concepts
exactly
behind them. It's how a god might appear as a human, and some of the things that they may end up doing. Those are very good books as well.
Yeah, how gods would interact with humans, things like that. It's a lot of good ideas that aren't necessarily things that I pick up and drop directly in, but they definitely shaped how I view fantasy and what I think fantasy is.
Definitely.
Moving on from novels, these are really young adult-ish novels for the most part that I just read growing up. But another thing that I want to talk about is the Bone series.
Oh yeah.
Again, we are not experts in comic books or graphic novels, but one of the people that we play Dungeons & Dragons with, Calvin, bought me and my brother the whole set of the Bone graphic novels.
And that's Jeff Smith?
Yeah.
He's the author, right?
Jeff Smith, is the author. And these are some of the greatest stories I have ever read.
They are so good. And they have a very odd combination of things happening, because you have essentially this kind of nutty, cartoony character, but then the story that is revolving around him
is extremely good. It's high fantasy,
and it's very serious.
It is. There's a lot of dark things that happen, especially later on in these books. They get violent and gruesome, and it's an interesting arc that I go through.
Jeff Smith manages in an expert way to keep the crazy, weird characters and the high fantasy story. He manages to thread them together, and he makes it work.
They're incredible.
If you get the chance, I highly recommend them. I'm with you. I think they're fantastic.
And there are things from the later on in these books. He brings in concepts of religious wars and all kinds of things in that are integral to the plot line. There's a lot of things later on that I really have picked up and just dropped in. But I of all the things that we're going to talk about today, if you haven't read these, you should, because they are incredible stories.
Fun, and they're just fun.
They really
fun
are.
Stories.
And they've got great morals of bravery and the little guy doing something impressive and great. And they're definitely worth reading. And if you have kids, absolutely recommend them. Can't say enough good things about this.
They're really good. They're really good.
Then finally, just a couple of movies that I would like to kind of talk about that came out more when I was a kid and that I grew up with. First of all, How to Train Your Dragon. If you've ever seen this, it's another thing that kind of gets discounted in terms of its fantasy value because of who it's aimed at. But great morals, great setting that's built for the whole thing. A lot of different things that you can take inspiration from.
I agree with that, and I think that, some parts of it I don't see myself integrating into my campaign, but there are specific things in there that I think are excellent.
Yeah.
What's the name of his of the Black Dragon? It's
Toothless.
Toothless.
Yeah.
The way that he ends up establishing a relationship with Toothless in the movies, is really good. And if you need to be able to say, okay, I'm not going to do that lock, stock, and barrel, but I'm going to take the way that it's done, tailor it to my campaign, and drop it into my campaign. And they're a great series.
Yeah.
It's a great series of movies.
But then also some Disney movies that came out when I was a kid, things like Tangled, Brave, if you've ever seen that.
Tangled especially. There's some great stuff.
That's just a great movie if you've never seen it.
There.
But it's a lot of things where we aren't taking things out directly and putting them in, but there's a lot of ideas, relationships, kind of characters, not in their exact copy, but ideas of characters
and the character interactions.
Exactly.
I think that's something that we really seem to boil a lot of this down to character interactions and character, not just with each other, but also with the environment that they find themselves in.
Absolutely.
And I think that there are some Disney movies who do a really good job of that. There are some that don't do such a good job, but there are some that have really good character interaction.
That are really good, yeah.
And what I really like about Tangled is the comedic aspects that you come across throughout that entire movie.
Yeah.
And it's not that I want to have comedy throughout my entire campaign, but every now and then
there needs to be a little sprinkle.
It needs to be some, and it can actually be pertinent to the story too.
Yeah.
But Tangled, for instance, does a really good job of setting up comedic interactions between characters and between characters and places. So
absolutely, yeah. It opens up new ideas and things that you can incorporate. Yeah. And I mean, if you haven't heard of some of the stuff that we've talked about here, absolutely check it out. We recommend it. They're all good things that we use a lot.
And if you have things that have given you inspiration, let us know, because I'm always on the lookout for something else that might give me some inspiration or some direction to go in a particular adventure, and you never know where that might end up coming from. So let us know in the comments what you've got that has inspired you over the years.
Or if you also like the Bone series, let me know, because I'll talk to you about it.
Or if you like Uncle Scrooge and Donald Duck comic books and you take inspiration from that, I'd be really curious to hear your side, your take on things, because I don't think there are many of you out there, but I encourage you to check it out.
Yeah. So we always love hearing from you guys. Let us know what you think in the comments below. We'll see you next time. That's it.
I'm Jim.
I'm Alex.
Keep your sword on free.
Bye-bye.